The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Cora Mercer would later say was appropriate, because Tuesday had always been the ugliest day of the week. Not the bleak honesty of Monday, not the false promise of Wednesday, just something flat and graceless and entirely without mercy. She was standing in the narrow hallway of her family's townhouse in Richmond, Virginia, still in her morning dress, when her mother pressed the sealed envelope into her hands with the careful neutrality of someone handing over a court summons. Her mother's face carried that particular set of lines around the mouth that Cora had come to recognize as the architecture of disappointment that had been constructed and reinforced over so many years that it had become structural, load-bearing, part of what held the whole Mercer household together. "Your father and I have made arrangements," her mother said. Cora turned the envelope over. The wax seal was already broken. Of course it was. She had been 23 years old in the spring of 1878, and in the 6 months since the incident with Thomas Hadley, which was not, it should be said, nearly as scandalous as her family had made it out to be, but which had managed to embarrass them thoroughly enough to close several drawing-room doors in Richmond society. Cora had watched herself become a subject rather than a person within her own home. She was discussed in low voices when she was presumed to be upstairs. She was steered away from windows when certain families passed in carriages. She had been removed from the guest list of the Hartley dinner party with the explanation that the seating had become complicated, which everyone understood and no one acknowledged. The letter was from a man named Josiah Pratt, who operated a dry goods store in a town called Caldera Falls in the New Mexico Territory. He was a cousin of her father's business associate. He was a widower with 2 small children, and he was apparently in need of a capable woman to manage his household. The arrangement had been handled through correspondence entirely between the men involved. Cora's preferences had not been consulted at any point in the process. She read the letter twice, standing in the hallway while her mother watched. "When?" Cora asked. 3 weeks, her mother said. "The train leaves from Richmond on the 14th. Cora folded the letter along its original creases and handed it back to her mother. She climbed the stairs to her room, closed the door with a softness that was more controlled and more deliberate than any slam could have been, and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time while the morning light moved across the wall. She was not a woman who cried easily. She was a woman who thought and then decided and then acted. She had always been that way, and it was partly this quality, this refusal to simply accept things without examining them first, that had gotten her into trouble with Thomas Hadley and the Richmond drawing-room circuit in the first place. But sitting in that room with the flat Tuesday light coming through the curtains, she allowed herself exactly 10 minutes of something that was not quite grief and not quite rage but lived in the territory between them. Then she began to pack. The journey west took 12 days by train, and Cora spent most of them reading. She had packed 4 novels and a journal, and she filled the journal quickly, not with sentiment but with observations. The land through the windows changed so gradually, and then so suddenly, that it startled her each time she looked up from a page. The green rolling certainty of Virginia gave way to the flat agricultural plains of Tennessee and Arkansas, and then something opened up, something enormous and indifferent, and the sky became a different kind of sky entirely, one that did not feel like a ceiling so much as an invitation. She changed trains twice and arrived in Santa Fe on the 26th of April, where a wagon was meant to be waiting to take her the remaining distance to Caldera Falls. She stood on the platform with her 2 trunks and her traveling bag, and the late afternoon sun pressing down on her with a heat that was nothing like Virginia heat. It was dry and direct, and somehow honest about itself, and she looked for whoever had been sent to collect her. The wagon that pulled up was driven by a young boy of perhaps 14 who introduced himself as Danny and said very little else for the first hour of the journey. The road wound through terrain that Cora had no vocabulary for, yet red rock formations and wide basins of scrub, and the distant suggestion of mountains that never seemed to get any closer. The sky overhead was turning colors she had no names for, deep orange and rose and a purple that was almost threatening in its beauty. "Is it always like this?" she asked the boy. He looked at the sky with the mild disinterest of someone who has seen a thing too many times to find it remarkable. "Like what?" "Like that," she said, gesturing broadly at everything. He considered. "Pretty much," he said. She arrived in Caldera Falls as the last light was leaving the sky, and the town revealed itself to her in pieces as the wagon rolled down the main street. A post office, a livery stable, a saloon with yellow light spilling from its windows, a general store, a barber shop, a small white church at the far end of the street that leaned very slightly to the left as if it had been listening for something and never quite straightened back up. There were perhaps 200 people in Caldera Falls. It was nothing like Richmond. It was nothing like anywhere she had ever been, and she found, to her own surprise, that this was not entirely unwelcome. Josiah Pratt met her at the door of his store, which also served as the lower floor of the house he lived in. He was a man in his mid-40s, weathered in the way of men who have spent years in direct sun, with a thick gray-threaded beard and eyes that were small and calculating in a way he tried to conceal behind a practiced pleasantness. His 2 children, a girl of 7 named Mee and a boy of 5 named Hector, stood behind him and stared at Cora with the frank curiosity of children who have not yet learned to disguise what they are thinking. "Miss Mercer," he said, "I trust the journey was acceptable." "It was long," she said, because she was too tired for pleasantries. Something shifted in his expression. She could not tell whether it was disapproval or respect, and he stepped aside to let her in. The house was not comfortable, but it was not terrible. Her room was small, with a single window that looked out toward the mountains that now, in the darkness, were merely a blacker black against the black of the sky. The arrangement was understood by both parties to be temporary. Josiah had made it clear in his letters that he was hoping for marriage, for a proper housekeeper and mother for his children, and Cora had read those letters carefully enough to understand that what he actually needed was an unpaid employee whom social convention would prevent from leaving. She had been sent as her family's solution to a problem, and she arrived as someone entirely aware of that fact. She washed her face and hands in the basin, sat on the narrow bed, and made herself a private promise. She would be here for exactly as long as she needed to be, and not one day longer. She did not know yet what that meant, or what came after, but she held the promise close like a coal that was not quite fire yet but had the potential for it. The town woke early. She discovered this the next morning when the sound of horses and voices and the particular clang of a smithy's hammer pulled her out of sleep before the sun was fully up. She dressed quickly, pinned her hair with less care than she would have in Richmond, and came downstairs to find Josiah already behind the counter of his store arranging tins on a shelf, with the methodical care of a man who finds deep comfort in order. He gave her a list of morning tasks without preamble. The children needed breakfast, the store needed sweeping, a delivery of flour sacks had come in yesterday and needed to be logged in the ledger. Cora looked at the list. Then she looked at Josiah. "I will take care of the children and the breakfast," she said. "I am happy to help with the store. I will not be keeping your ledger without a formal arrangement about compensation." He blinked. "I beg your pardon." "I am here as a guest," she said, "pending a decision that has not yet been made. I am not your employee, Mr. Pratt." The silence between them was long enough to be meaningful. "Very well," he said finally, and turned back to his shelf, and Cora went to make breakfast for 2 children who were watching her from the doorway with wide eyes, and she felt, despite everything, a small flicker of something that might have been satisfaction. The town of Caldera Falls began to make itself known to her in the days that followed, the way a shy animal might revealing itself a little at a time, from a safe distance, until you had seen enough to understand its nature. She learned the rhythms of the main street, which turned busy mid-morning and quieted in the scorching hours after noon, and came alive again in the early evening when the men came in from the ranches and the farms, and the day's work settled into something more sociable. She learned the names of the women who ran things: Mrs. Clara Webb at the post office, who knew everything that happened in Caldera Falls before it happened; Mrs. Dolores Ruiz, whose family had been in the territory since before any of the Anglo settlers arrived, and who ran a small restaurant out of her home that produced food so good it was almost an argument against everything else in life; and Agnes Holt, who was the wife of the sheriff and who had a laugh that could be heard from one end of the main street to the other, and who extended her friendship to Cora on the third day with the unceremonious directness of a woman who simply did not have time for the formal preamble of genteel society. "You are the woman Josiah sent for from back east," Agnes said, appearing beside Cora at the dry goods counter. "My family sent me," Cora said carefully. "I am not sure it is the same thing." Agnes considered this. "I suppose it is not," she said. "I am Agnes Holt. My husband is the one with the badge who looks more worried than anyone that worried ought to look." Cora smiled for what felt like the first time since Virginia. "Cora Mercer. You want to come for supper on Friday, Cora Mercer?" "Yes," Cora said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "I would very much like that." It was on a Wednesday of that same first week that she first saw Bernard Conroy. She was coming out of the post office, where she had sent a brief and carefully neutral letter to her mother confirming her safe arrival, when a horse came up the main street at a pace that was not quite alarming, but was certainly faster than was polite. The man riding it pulled up outside the livery stable with the easy grace of someone who has spent so many years on horseback that the horse has stopped being a separate creature and become instead an extension of himself. He swung down from the saddle in one fluid motion, said something to the horse that was too quiet to hear, and handed the reins to the stable boy with a brief exchange that ended in what appeared to be a mutual agreement of some kind. He was perhaps 26 or 27, tall and lean in the way the western sun tends to make men, not thin, but economical, as if the land itself had edited away everything that was not necessary. He wore a dark hat that had seen better decades and a coat that was good quality in a previous life, and a pair of boots that were genuinely excellent, which told Cora something, though she was not yet sure what. His face was angular and serious in the way of a man who has formed the habit of considering things before he acts, and his eyes, when they swept briefly across the street and landed for 1/2 second on hers, were the warm, dark brown of river water in autumn. He did not smile. He did not particularly acknowledge her. He simply went about his business, which appeared to involve a brief conversation with the postmaster, a stop at the hardware store, and the purchase of something at the general store that she could not see clearly. And then he was back on his horse and gone back down the road with the same unhurried efficiency with which he had arrived. "That is Bernard Conroy," said a voice at her elbow, and she turned to find Mrs. Clara Webb regarding the direction of the departing horse with a fond, familiar expression. "Has a horse ranch about 6 miles north of town. Good man, quiet, does not make trouble and does not tolerate it, which in this part of the territory amounts to a virtue." "I was not asking," Cora said. "You were about to," Clara said mildly, and went back inside her post office. Cora stood in the street for a moment with the dry wind moving past her and the mountains steady and blue in the distance, and she thought, well. She saw him again the following Saturday, at the feed and supply store where she had gone on an errand for Josiah. He was there before her, in conversation with the store's owner about the price of something in quantities that suggested he was buying for a working ranch and not a household, and she found herself listening to him speak even though the conversation had nothing to do with her, not because of the content, but because of the quality of his voice, which was measured and low, and had a warmth in it that she had not expected from a man whose face was arranged so seriously. He noticed her when she was waiting for the owner to come back to the counter, and he turned with the slight raise of the hat that was the standard courtesy of the territory, but his eyes paused on her face for a moment longer than strictly required. "Miss Mercer," he said, "you have been here about a week." "You know my name," she said. "It is a small town," he said, Everyone knows everyone's name within the first 3 days. You took a bit longer than average, which means you were not going out of your way to be noticed. She looked at him steadily. No, she said, I was not. That is an interesting choice for someone new, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that might, in different circumstances, become a smile. I am making my own assessments before I invite anyone else's opinions, she said. And how are the assessments going? Still forming, she said. And then the owner returned and they each attended to their separate business, and he left before she did. And she stood at the counter completing her transaction with the very specific awareness that she was thinking about the sound of his voice. The weeks settled into something like a routine. She managed Josiah's children with a genuine fondness that surprised her. Me and Hector were, beneath their initial wariness, funny and curious and delightful in the way of small children who have not yet been asked to be anything other than themselves. And Cora found herself drawn to them in a way that had nothing to do with any arrangement their father had made. She helped in the store in the mornings, took the children walking in the afternoons, and spent her evenings reading or in conversation with Agnes Holt, whose friendship had become one of the genuine good things about Caldera Falls. It was Agnes who first said it plainly. They were sitting on the Holt's porch on a warm evening in late May, and the stars over the territory were doing the thing they did that stars in Virginia never did, which was to appear in such numbers and at such apparent closeness that looking up at them felt like a kind of vertigo. Josiah is going to propose to you, Agnes said. He has been working himself up to it for about 2 weeks. Cora watched a star fall in a long, quiet arc. I know. What will you say? The pause was long enough to be a complete answer, but Cora filled it anyway. No, she said, I am going to say no. And then what? I do not know yet, she said honestly, but I cannot marry him. I do not love him, and I do not think I could come to, and more importantly, I think he is a man who needs someone to manage for him, and I have spent enough of my life being managed. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then, what will you do for money if not that? I can teach, Cora said. I have always been able to teach. Does this town have a school? Agnes made a sound that managed to be both a laugh and a sigh. We have a room with some desks in it, and a man named Ferris who drinks too much to remember where the desks are on Fridays. I would say that technically constitutes a school. Then it constitutes an opportunity, Cora said. She was in the feed and supply store again the following Tuesday when Bernard Conroy came in with a boy she had not seen before, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, who had the same serious dark eyes and was clearly his brother or his son, and Cora revised. The boy introduced himself as Eli and Bernard introduced him as his nephew, son of his sister Margaret, who was managing a claim near the Colorado border and had sent Eli to help Bernard for the summer, which Eli appeared to be regarding as an adventure of the highest order. Eli immediately began to tell Cora everything about the ranch, about the horses Bernard raised, which were quarter horses primarily, bred for working cattle, about the foal that had been born 2 weeks ago and which Eli had been permitted to name, and had named Biscuit on the grounds that it was the color of one, about the creek that ran through the property which had fish in it that Eli was determined to catch before summer ended. Bernard watched his nephew talk with an expression of quiet amusement that was more open and readable than anything Cora had seen on his face before. He looked in that moment like a man who had something he was very fond of and was not entirely sure he deserved it. He talks a great deal, Bernard said when Eli paused for breath. I like talking, Eli announced without apology. I know, said Bernard. I think it is admirable, Cora said to Eli. Most people know things and do not say them. You know things and say them. It is better. Eli considered this with the gravity of a philosopher. That is what I think too, he said. Bernard looked at her then, and it was not the brief glance of a social courtesy. It was the look of someone who has registered something unexpected and is deciding what to do with it. That is a kind thing to say, he said. It is a true thing, she said. They walked out of the store at the same time, Eli running ahead with the bundle he had been sent to collect, and Bernard fell into step beside her on the boardwalk for the half-block before their paths diverged, and in that short distance he said, "Agnes Holt tells me you are thinking of teaching." She glanced at him. "Agnes Holt tells everyone everything." "She does," he agreed. "It is a terrible habit that the whole town relies on entirely. Are you—" "I am going to speak to the school board," she said, which there was only one of, and it was a committee of 3 men who met on the second Monday of each month. "You should," he said. "The children here need a proper teacher. Old Ferris knows his letters well enough, but he loses the thread somewhere around arithmetic." "Did you go to school here?" she asked. "I went as far as the territory had school to give," he said. "Then I taught myself the rest." He said it without self-pity, as a statement of fact. "My father had a ranch in Texas and believed that useful knowledge was more important than formal knowledge, which was not entirely wrong but left some gaps." "What kind of gaps?" "Poetry," he said, and the corner of his mouth did that almost smile again. "I know no poetry whatsoever." "That is a solvable problem," she said. "Is it?" He stopped at the point where the boardwalk ended, and she stopped too, and they were facing each other in the afternoon sun, with the whole town going about its business around them. "Yes," she said, "though I would warn you that some of it is very long." This time it was a real smile, brief and genuine, transforming his face in a way that she filed carefully in some internal register. "I have been warned," he said, and he went his way and she went hers, and she walked back to Josiah's store with the afternoon sun on her back and something humming quietly in her chest that she was not yet prepared to name. Josiah proposed on the first Friday of June, in the kitchen after the children were asleep, with the stiff formality of a man executing a plan he has rehearsed but has limited faith in. He stood on the other side of the kitchen table, as if the table itself were a kind of armor, and he said the words with his eyes somewhere near her left shoulder rather than her face, and she listened to them with a full and attentive respect for what was genuinely difficult about the moment. When he was done, she said, "Mr. Pratt, I am grateful that you have provided a place for me to come to, and I mean that sincerely, but I cannot marry you. I am sorry for the inconvenience this creates." He took it better than she had expected, actually with a tight-jawed dignity that she respected, and then a kind of relieved exhale that suggested he had been hoping for this outcome on some level he had not admitted to himself. "You are not what I was expecting," he said finally. "My cousin said you were a quiet girl." "Your cousin does not know me," she said pleasantly. She spent the following 2 weeks making alternative arrangements, with Agnes's help and Clara Webb's logistical expertise, and the general goodwill of the women of Caldera Falls who seemed, without announcement, to have decided that Cora Mercer was worth the effort. She found lodgings with a widow named Mrs. Estelle Fitch, who had a spare room and a vegetable garden and opinions about everything that she shared freely and without embarrassment. She presented herself to the school board on the second Monday of June, and after 30 minutes of discussion, during which she answered their questions about her qualifications with such precise and confident competence that the board appeared to feel slightly abashed, she was offered the position of teacher for the coming term starting in September, at a salary that was modest but sufficient. She told Josiah on a Monday, and he received the news with the measured acceptance of a man who has already adjusted his internal accounting. "Me cried," which undid Cora more thoroughly than anything Josiah could have said, and she held the girl for a long time and promised that she was not going far and that me could come find her at Mrs. Fitch's house whenever she liked, and me made her promise 3 times before she believed it. She moved her trunks to Mrs. Fitch's on a Wednesday afternoon, carrying them herself with the help of Danny, the boy who had driven her wagon from Santa Fe, and who had since revealed himself to be a person of considerable practical usefulness. The room was small but had a good window and a desk, and she arranged her books on the shelf above the desk with the private ceremony of a person establishing the central fact of their own life. It was in this period, the weeks between settling at Mrs. Fitch's and the start of the school term, that she began to truly know the town, and in knowing the town began to truly know Bernard Conroy. He rode in on Tuesdays and Saturdays always, and she found that her own schedule had accommodated this without her having made any conscious decision about it. She was at the post office on Tuesdays and at the general store on Saturdays, and she had stopped examining the coincidence very carefully because the examination was not the interesting part. What was interesting was the conversations themselves, which began to lengthen, gradually, from the half-block of boardwalk to the full block, and then to the bench outside the post office, and then to the hour they spent one Saturday afternoon in late June sitting in the chairs outside the hardware store while a thunderstorm that had rolled in with absolutely no warning rolled back out again, and the street ran with red mud and the mountains in the distance were periodically lit in dramatic detail. She told him about Richmond that afternoon more than she had told anyone. About the drawing rooms and the social machinery, and the incident with Thomas Hadley, which was simply that she had written a letter to a newspaper under a masculine pseudonym expressing a political opinion about the territorial question in the West. And Thomas Hadley, who had been courting her, had recognized the opinion as hers and been offended not by the opinion, but by the deception, and had told several people, and the telling had unraveled a great deal very quickly. She told it without embellishment and without apology, and Bernard listened with the quality of attention she had come to value in him, which was total and unperforming and had no visible agenda. And that was enough to send you west, he said when she was done. The West was their idea of correction, she said. The theory was that if they placed me somewhere remote enough, I would be grateful for whatever I found there and become accordingly more manageable. Bernard was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain was tapering off and a rainbow was assembling itself with great color and confidence over the eastern ridge. That is their loss, he said, and our good fortune. She looked at him. The territories, he clarified, and she thought she saw a faint color in his face that might have been a different kind of clarification. A town like this needs a proper teacher. Yes, she said, I believe that is exactly what I am here to be. The summer deepened. Eli went back to his mother in Colorado at the end of July, leaving with great dramatic grief that made Bernard laugh for the first time in a way that was completely unguarded. And the ranch was quieter after that in a way Bernard mentioned once and only briefly. But she heard the thing underneath the words, which was that it was the kind of quiet that has too much space in it. She had been to the ranch twice by then. Once for a Sunday gathering that Bernard had hosted for a dozen neighbors, which was a genuine social institution in the territory where distances meant that visiting was rare enough to become an occasion, and once at his invitation to see Biscuit the foal, which was now several weeks old and possessed of a personality that was exactly as assertive as Eli had suggested. The ranch was beautiful in a way that was not decorative but functional. The house was large and well-made, the stables clean and carefully organized, the horses themselves extraordinary, moving in the fields with the kind of effortless power that made everything else seem like it was trying too hard. She had stood at the fence watching a group of them in the late afternoon light and felt something shift in her understanding of him. A man who lived like this, in such close attention to the living things under his care, was a man with a particular kind of patience and a particular kind of love, even if he was not the kind of man who would use the word. You love them, she said. He leaned on the fence beside her. I do, he said simply. It shows. They stood there in comfortable silence for a while, the horses moving in the gold light, and she was aware of him very specifically, the steadiness of him, the way he occupied his own space without demanding anything of the space around him, the fact that she had been standing here for several minutes and it felt like being somewhere she belonged. She wrote to her mother in August. Not the careful neutral letter of her arrival, but a real one, honest and without particular rancor but without apology either. She described the territory, the town, her students who would be arriving in September. She described Mrs. Fitch and Agnes Holt and Clara Webb. She did not describe Bernard Conroy, because she had not yet found the language for him that would not say too much or too little. Her mother's reply arrived 3 weeks later and said, in its essence, that Cora's decisions were her own, and that her father hoped she was being sensible. It was not warmth exactly, but it was not the door closed entirely either, and Cora read it twice and put it in her desk drawer and thought, well, that is something, and let it be enough. School started on the first Monday of September, and the 21 children of Caldera Falls and its surrounding ranches arrived with varying degrees of enthusiasm and a general collective energy that reminded Cora of a previously contained river, suddenly permitted to be a river again. She discovered within the first week that she was genuinely good at teaching, not just competent, but good in the way of someone whose own love of thinking is contagious, and the children seemed to catch it like a fever that improved them. She taught reading and arithmetic and a geography lesson on Wednesdays that rapidly became the most anticipated part of the week, because she turned it into a story about the whole wide world, with all its peoples and landscapes and impossible facts, and the children sat still for it in a way they sat still for almost nothing else. Bernard appeared at the schoolhouse door one afternoon in early October. She was staying late to prepare lessons while the light lasted, and stood for a moment looking at the room, the desks and the maps she had pinned to the walls and the small shelf of books she had assembled from every source she could find. "I brought the books you asked about," he said. He was carrying a small crate. She had mentioned in conversation that she was looking for copies of certain texts, and he had said he thought he might have something useful in his own collection, which was larger than she had expected for a man who lived alone on a horse ranch 6 miles from town. She helped him unload the crate onto her desk, and they went through the volumes together, standing shoulder to shoulder without either of them having arranged it that way, and she could feel the warmth of him in the cool autumn air of the schoolhouse and was almost amused at herself for noticing it as specifically as she did. "This one," she said, holding up a volume. "This is perfect." "May I borrow it?" "Keep it," he said. "That is generous. It is more useful to someone who will read it." She looked at him. "Do you not read?" "I read," he said. "But I have read that one 3 times and I know what I think about it and I am interested in what you think about it, and this is a better use of the book." "What do you think about it?" she asked. He told her, and she disagreed with about a third of it and said so, and he argued back with a precision and intelligence that delighted her, and they stood in the empty schoolhouse in the October light, arguing about a book for 45 minutes before she noticed the light, and said that she had to get back to Mrs. Fitch's before dark. He walked her back. It was the first time he had done so explicitly, rather than falling into step beside her as a matter of coincidental direction. It was a small thing. It was not small. At the door of Mrs. Fitch's house he stopped. "Cora," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without the formal prefix, and it landed in the air between them with a weight that both of them felt. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that serious, considering face, and she thought, say it, and she was not sure whether she was thinking it at him or at herself. "I would like," he said carefully, "to come and call on you, formally, if that is agreeable to you." The evening was very still around them. Somewhere down the street a dog was having an argument with something in the distance, and the first stars were beginning to appear over the mountains, and the air smelled of wood smoke and the particular dry sweetness of the high desert in autumn. "Yes," she said, "that is very agreeable to me." He came on Sunday, at 4 in the afternoon, with his hat in his hands and a bunch of wildflowers that she was certain he had picked himself at some point that day, and that had clearly been rowed in his coat pocket for some time, which she found deeply endearing and absolutely did not say. Mrs. Fitch received him with the frank approval of a woman who has been observing a situation for some time, and is pleased to see it advance, And then she absented herself to her garden with entirely transparent tact. They sat on the porch in the cool October air and talked for 2 hours, and it was nothing like the drawing-room courtships of Richmond. It was not performed or managed or directed toward any particular outcome. It was simply two people telling each other the truth about themselves with the territory spread out before them in the long light of a Sunday afternoon, the mountains blue and permanent on the horizon, the town quiet around them. He told her about his family, his father's ranch in Texas, the years of hard work that had taught him everything useful he knew, the death of his mother when he was 17 that had reorganized his understanding of what mattered and what did not. He told her about coming to the New Mexico territory at 22, with a small amount of saved money and a specific idea about the kind of horses he wanted to raise, and the 5 years of work that had built the ranch into what it was now. He told her about his sister Margaret, whom he clearly adored, and about Eli, who was Margaret's greatest achievement and most challenging project simultaneously. She told him more than she had told anyone. About the books she had loved since childhood, about the specific way her mind worked, turning things over and over until she understood them from every angle, which had been regarded by her family as a kind of stubbornness, but which she recognized now as simply how she was. About what she wanted, and she was specific about this, because she had spent too long letting other people be vague about it on her behalf, which was a life that was genuinely hers, built on work she chose and relationships she chose, and a freedom to think and say what she actually thought. He listened to this last part with complete attention, and when she was done he said, "I think I have been waiting for someone who spoke like that without knowing it was what I was waiting for." She looked at him directly. "What do you mean?" "I mean that every arrangement I have ever seen between men and women out here, and there are good arrangements, honest ones, I do not mean to say otherwise, but most of them start from necessity and negotiate toward something like affection. And I have always thought that it could go the other direction, that if you started from the right place, you would end somewhere better." He paused, and he was not a man who was accustomed to speaking at this length about this kind of thing, and she could see the effort of it and found it remarkable and tender. "I did not know who that person was, but I think I know now." "Bernard," she said. "Yes. I think I know too," she said. He came the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and by the third Sunday they were walking rather than sitting, and by the fourth they had walked out past the edge of town to a place where a creek ran through a stand of cottonwoods that had gone gold in the autumn and made a sound like very quiet applause, and they sat on the bank and talked, and then were quiet together in the way that only people who are genuinely comfortable with each other can be quiet. He took her hand on the way back. Not with ceremony, simply reaching out and taking it as if it were a decision he had made and was done deliberating about. She curled her fingers into his and felt the roughness of his palm and the warmth of it and thought, "There it is. I want to be honest with you about something," he said. "All right," she said. "I have not been in a hurry to do any of this," he said. "Any of the courtship or whatever word you want to use, not because I did not want to, but because I wanted to be certain I was doing it right, that I was not making assumptions about what you wanted or who you were." She looked at him as they walked. "You have been very careful about that," she said. "I noticed." "Was it too slow?" he asked, and there was a genuine uncertainty in the question that she found disarming. "No," she said. "It was right." November brought its first cold snaps, and the town took on a different quality. People stayed indoors more. The evenings shortened. The social life that in summer had spread across porches and street corners compressed itself into interiors, around fires and dinner tables. Cora went to the Holts for dinner on Thursdays and often found Bernard there as well, and she observed that Agnes orchestrated these coincidences with the quiet confidence of a general who had been planning a campaign for some time, and was pleased with how it was progressing. One evening in mid-November, Agnes pulled her aside in the kitchen while Bernard and Sheriff Holt were in the front room arguing genially about some ranching matter. He told Thomas Holt he has never met anyone like you, Agnes said, with the directness of someone who has decided that the information is too important to withhold. Cora was quiet for a moment, holding the mug of coffee Agnes had just poured her. Agnes, she said. I know, Agnes said. I should not have told you. I am telling you anyway. How does he mean it? Cora asked, even though she thought she knew. How do you think? Agnes said and went back to the front room, and Cora stood in the kitchen for a moment with the steam rising from her mug and the warmth of the stove at her back, and the sound of Bernard's voice in the next room, unhurried and thoughtful, and something in her chest felt very full. She returned to Richmond for Christmas. She had not planned to, but a letter from her younger sister Eleanor had arrived in late October, and Eleanor, who was 19 and had never been party to the management of Cora's departure in the way their parents had been, simply asked her to come if she could. Eleanor missed her. It was stated plainly and without strategy, and Cora found she could not refuse it. The journey took 12 days each way, which meant she was gone for the better part of a month, and she found this month significant in a way she had not expected. Not because Richmond was miserable. It was not, particularly. Her parents were cautious around her in a way that suggested they had registered that their solution had not gone quite as planned and were adjusting their expectations accordingly. And Eleanor was wonderful and warm and had 1,000 questions about everything. But because she was aware, for every day of it, of what she was temporarily without. She wrote to Bernard from Richmond, which was forward by the standards of either location but which she had decided to do anyway, and he wrote back a long letter, 4 pages in his careful handwriting, describing the ranch in the December cold, the horses he was watching, a piece of equipment he had repaired, a book he had finished, and then at the end, in language that was more unguarded than anything he had said aloud to her yet, a paragraph in which he said he hoped the journey was not changing her mind about anything, because he found, to his own slight surprise, that he thought about her all the time and wished she was back, and intended to say more about that when she returned. She read this paragraph 3 times on the train back west, and each time it worked on her in the same specific way, like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. She arrived back in Caldera Falls on the 3rd of January, 1879, in a light snow that was turning the whole town briefly clean and quiet, and Bernard was at the station. She had not told him which day she was arriving. She had told Agnes, because Agnes needed to know on account of Mrs. Fitch, but she had not told Bernard, which meant that Agnes had told Bernard, and she made a mental note to thank Agnes at the first opportunity. He was standing at the platform with his hat dusted with snow, and when she came down from the train car he looked at her with that careful, serious face, and then he said, "Welcome back," and she said, "I read your letter 3 times," and the color that came into his face was the most honest thing she had ever seen in her life. He carried her trunk to Mrs. Fitch's, and they had tea at the kitchen table while Mrs. Fitch pretended to be busy elsewhere, and he told her about the month and she told him about Richmond, and at one point she said, with the particular honesty she had promised herself she would always bring to anything real, "I am glad to be back. This is where I want to be." He put down his cup. He looked at her across the table. "Cora," he said. "Yes. I have been trying to find the right moment to say something," he said. "I kept thinking I needed a particular setting for it or a particular circumstance, and I have now understood that there is no perfect moment. There is only the actual moment, and this is the actual moment." "All right," she said. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for a while, and I wanted you to know it clearly and without me hiding it behind any other kind of language." The snow was coming down outside the window, and Mrs. Fitch's kitchen was warm, and the tea was getting cold, and Cora looked at Bernard Conroy across the table and thought about the letter she had received in the narrow hallway in Richmond, and her family's solution, and the Tuesday that had no mercy in it, and the 12 days on the train through changing land, and the red rock and the wide sky, and the way he had said that is their loss and the territory's good fortune, and how that sentence had lodged in her and stayed there. "I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been trying to be cautious about it, but I believe caution has run its course." He reached across the table, and she put her hand in his, and they sat like that while the snow fell outside and Mrs. Fitch made unnecessary amounts of noise in the next room. He proposed in February, on the day after a late winter storm had blown through and left the whole territory covered in white that made everything look like the beginning of something. He had ridden to town and knocked at Mrs. Fitch's door in the late morning, and Mrs. Fitch had let him in with a knowing look that she had not tried very hard to conceal, and he had asked Cora if she would walk with him, and she had put on her coat and her boots, and they had walked out to the edge of town, where the snow lay untracked, and the mountains were extraordinary in the cold, clear light. He did not have a rehearsed speech. He had, she suspected, thought about this conversation at considerable length, and then abandoned the rehearsal as insufficient. Instead, he simply said, in the direct and unadorned way he had of saying the things that mattered most, "I want to marry you. I want to share my life with you specifically. I want to build something with you that belongs to both of us and not to anyone's ideas about who we should be. I know this territory did not ask you to come here, but I am asking you now to stay." The cold air was sharp and clean in her lungs, and the sky was the particular blue it became after a storm deep and absolute, and she thought about her room above Josiah's store on the night she had arrived, and the promise she had made herself in the dark. "Yes," she said. "Yes. That is exactly what I want." He kissed her then, not tentatively, but with the full and certain warmth of a man who has made a decision and is entirely at peace with it. And she kissed him back with the same conviction, her hands against the lapels of his coat, the snow around them and the mountains ahead of them and the town behind them and the whole territory wild and wide and entirely theirs. They were married in April, in the small white church at the end of the main street that leaned slightly to the left, on a morning when the wildflowers that came up in the high desert spring had turned the ground between the rocks into something improbable and joyful. Agnes Holt stood with Cora as her witness, with the full satisfaction of a woman who has had a theory confirmed. Sheriff Holt and a neighbor of Bernard's named Cal Dupree stood with him. Mrs. Fitch sat in the front pew and cried, which she had announced she would do, and which she did with great commitment. Mrs. Dollars Ruiz had brought food enough for twice the number of people present, which meant there was abundance, and the reception in the street afterward went on until it was dark, and the stars came out in that way they had, close and plentiful and lit from within. Cora wrote to her parents and to Alina. The letter to her parents was composed with care, not cold, but honest about what she had built and where she had built it, and what this marriage was and was not. The letter to Alina was long and full of the specific joy that she had not allowed herself to fully inhabit until it was unambiguously hers. Alina wrote back within the month, and her letter was so warm and so full of happiness for her sister that Cora read it aloud to Bernard over breakfast, and then had to fold it away quickly when her eyes became inconveniently full. He said nothing about it, but he put his hand over hers on the table, and that was the right response to all of it. Moving to the ranch was a complete sensory overhaul. She had grown accustomed to Mrs. Fitch's spare room and the sounds of the town, and the ranch was a different kind of noise, the particular language of horses in the morning, the wind through the grass, the sound of the land being worked. She learned the rhythm of it the way she had learned the rhythm of the town, through patient attention and a willingness to be wrong about things in the process of understanding them. She continued to teach through the spring term. The school board had asked whether her marriage would affect her position, and she had looked at them steadily and said that she did not see why it would, and after a moment of collective recalibration they had agreed. Bernard drove her to town on school days and picked her up in the afternoon with a reliability that her students came to depend on as a kind of secondary schedule. When Mr. Conroy's horse was at the hitching post outside the schoolhouse, school was nearly over. She rearranged parts of the ranch house with his cheerful participation. He was, she discovered, a man who had strong opinions about where horses should be kept and very limited opinions about where furniture should be placed, which made the domestic adjustment of living together largely smooth. She put her books on the shelves in the main room, and he moved the chair closest to the fire to make a better reading position. And these small negotiations accumulated into a shared life with a naturalness that she had not dared to hope for. In the evenings, when the work was done and the horses were settled, and the desert was doing its extraordinary thing with the last light, they sat on the porch of the ranch house and read, or talked, or said nothing, and the silence between them was a companionable and easy thing, the silence of two people who are not afraid of what might appear in it. She wrote in her journal still, but the tone of it had changed. The entries were not the careful strategizing of a woman managing a difficult situation. They were the observations of a person who has landed, who is genuinely in the place she has chosen to be. July brought a letter from Margaret, Bernard's sister in Colorado, announcing that she was planning to visit with Eli in August, and the anticipation of this in the ranch house was palpable and wonderful. Eli, in the year since Cora had met him, had continued to grow in both height and conversational ambition, and his letters arrived monthly with detailed accounts of everything he was learning and thinking and doing. She had been corresponding with him directly since January, partly as an extension of the teaching instinct she could not turn off, and partly because Eli was genuinely excellent company on paper. Bernard Conroy arrived on an August Wednesday that was the hottest day of the summer, stepping down from the stagecoach with the look of a woman who has been on bad roads for too long and is ready to be still for a while. She was 31, with Bernard's serious dark eyes and a face that had more humor in it than his, and she embraced her brother with the unself-conscious force of people who are genuinely glad of each other. And then she turned to Cora with a look of frank and friendly appraisal. "He has told me a great deal about you in his letters," she said. "I hope some of it was accurate," Cora said. "All of it was," Margaret said. "He is annoyingly truthful." She took Cora's hands in hers and held them for a moment. "I am glad he found you," she said simply. "I was starting to worry that he was going to spend his life being excellent in isolation." "I heard that," Bernard said. "I meant you to," Margaret said, and then Eli appeared around the side of the stagecoach and launched himself at Cora with the complete physical confidence of a child who has decided you are family. "I have been practicing arithmetic," he announced into her shoulder, "every day." "Because I knew you would ask," she hugged him back. "I am absolutely going to ask," she confirmed. The month of August was one of the best of Cora's life, and she knew it while it was happening, which was a gift she did not take lightly. Margaret was quick and funny, and had a rancher's practical competence and a traveler's appetite for conversation, and the evenings on the ranch porch with Bernard and Margaret and Eli were lit up in a way that the porch had not been before. Margaret told stories about their childhood in Texas that made Cora understand Bernard in new dimensions. The boy he had been, serious even then, but full of a quiet humor that came out in particular circumstances, fiercely protective of the people he loved, with a stubbornness about certain principles that was not stubbornness exactly, but something more like structural integrity. One evening, when the men had gone in and it was just the two of them under the stars with the remnants of dinner on the table, Margaret said, "He was very lonely before you came. He would not have said so. He probably would have said he was content, and he would have meant it because he can find contentment in the work. But it is different now. You must know it is different." "I know," Cora said. "Good," said Margaret. "I wanted to make sure you knew." Margaret and Eli left at the end of August with plans to return at Christmas, plans that were made with the warm seriousness of people who mean what they say. Eli cried when he left, which he pretended he was not doing, and which everyone pretended not to notice, and then he got on his horse with great dignity and rode beside his mother's wagon with the composure of a person who has made a private arrangement with their grief and intends to honor it. Autumn came. The school term started again, and Cora now had 26 students. because word of a genuine teacher had circulated through the surrounding ranches and farms, and several families had decided their children should make the journey. She organized the school more formally, different levels of instruction, older children helping younger ones in a structure she had read about and adapted to the specific needs of the territory. She requested more books from the board, and when they hesitated about the cost, she fundraised for them herself through a series of evening lectures she delivered at the saloon, which was the largest meeting space in Caldera Falls, about geography and history and the natural sciences, which were attended by a remarkable number of people who were, she suspected, less interested in the educational content and more interested in the novelty of a woman who could hold a room. Bernard attended every single one of these lectures, sitting in the back with his hat in his hands and a cup of coffee, and when she was done he would always have one question, thoughtful, well chosen, the kind of question that made the whole room think rather than just him, and she began to suspect that this was not accidental. "You make the questions harder than they need to be," she told him one evening on the ride home. "I make them as hard as they need to be," he said. "To what end?" "Because the room thinks better when the question is good," he said, "and because you answer better when the question is real." She looked at him in the darkness of the road, the stars overhead and the horses' hooves on the packed earth, and felt the specific love that is not passionate urgency but something deeper and more permanent, the love of genuine knowing. "You have been paying attention," she said. "Always," he said. In November she told him that she was expecting a child. She told him at breakfast, with the simple directness she had brought to every important thing between them, and watched his face go through several things very quickly: surprise, then something that was not quite surprise because some part of him had been aware, then a joy so complete that it temporarily dismantled the habitual seriousness of his expression. He put down his fork. He looked at her. "When?" he asked. "June," she said. "I think June." He came around the table and took her face in his hands, and the warmth of them was the warmth of a man who has worked hard all his life and had it produce something that was not what he expected and better than anything he planned, and he kissed her in a way that was different from any previous kiss because it was wholly without reserve. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Perfectly well," she said. "Slightly nauseous in the mornings. Otherwise entirely capable of every single thing I usually do, which I will need you to remember." He laughed. "I will remember," he said. "I will try not to be ridiculous about it." "You will be slightly ridiculous," she said. "I am resigned to it." He was, in the event, exactly the right amount of concerned without being overbearing about it, which she attributed to his general quality of paying attention to what was actually needed rather than what was conventional. He did not suggest she stop teaching, because he understood what teaching was to her, and the suggestion would have been absurd. He did quietly ensure that the buckboard he drove her in on school days was the most comfortable vehicle they owned, and he occasionally appeared at the schoolhouse in the late afternoon with something to eat that she had not asked for, and she found she was not as annoyed at this as she would have been if anyone else had done it. Christmas came, and Margaret and Eli arrived as promised, and the ranch house held all of them with a fullness that was warm and loud and beautiful, and Eli spent 3 days being indignant about the prospect of a new cousin until he worked through his feelings and arrived at enthusiasm, which he then expressed with considerable force. There was a Christmas dinner that Agnes and Mrs. Fitch and Dollars Ruiz and their respective families came to, and the table was extended with a board that Bernard had made in the shop behind the stable, and the evening went on long and warm and ended with Eli asleep on the porch under a blanket that someone had quietly put over him, and the adults sitting with their after-dinner coffee under the winter sky. "This was a good idea, Cora," said Agnes, looking at the table and the house and the whole assembled life. "Most of it was not my idea," Cora said. "It was your presence that made it possible," Agnes said firmly and clinked her cup against Cora's. Margaret stayed through January and then returned to Colorado, and February came with its cold certainty, and then March. And then April, which brought the wildflowers again, exactly as they had appeared on the morning of her wedding. And she stood at the fence of the horse pasture one April morning with the sun on her face and her hands on the fence rail, and the foal that had been Biscuit, now almost 2 years old and considerably more confident than his early personality had suggested, walking the fence line. And she thought about the letter on Tuesday in the hallway in Richmond, and the 12 days west, and the moment on the platform in Santa Fe when the sun was going down and the land was doing its impossible thing. She thought about her family's theory of correction. She thought about being sent somewhere remote as a solution to the problem of herself. She thought, there was never anything wrong with me. She thought, they sent me west as their last embarrassment, and he said that was their loss, and it was. It was their loss entirely, and this is what it gave her. This land, this town, this man and this life and this child coming in June. This school with 26 children who looked at maps on Wednesday afternoons and saw the whole world. This morning, this fence, these mountains, permanent and blue. The baby came on the 15th of June, a Tuesday, which Cora would later say was evidence that the day had been trying to redeem itself all along. And he arrived into the world with considerable noise and the specific urgency of someone who has things to say, and is not interested in waiting any longer to say them. He was a boy, and they named him Daniel James Conroy, after Bernard's father James, and for no particular reason Daniel except that it suited him, which they were certain of immediately. Bernard held his son for the first time with the slightly stunned expression of a man confronted with something that has exceeded every previous category of important, and Cora watched his face and the baby's face and felt something so large it had no name she could find in any language she had been taught. "Hello," Bernard said to the baby, very quietly, with the full gravity of a man addressing a person of consequence. "I am your father. We are very glad you are here." The baby continued to express his opinions loudly, which Bernard received with absolute equanimity. Agnes was first through the door because of course she was, and then Mrs. Fitch and then Dolores Ruiz arrived with food because Dolores Ruiz's response to any significant event was to arrive with food, which was the right response. Clara Webb sent a note that said congratulations and I told you so, which was the right note. Margaret arrived a week later, having received the telegram and ridden south with a speed that suggested she had simply gotten on her horse and pointed it in the right direction. And she held her nephew with the practiced comfort of a mother, and told him that he was the best-looking member of the Conroy family, which Bernard objected to mildly and without conviction. Eli, now 11, and in the middle of a growth that was rapidly making him almost as tall as his uncle, regarded baby Daniel with a mixture of scientific curiosity and proprietary pride. He had, he announced, suggestions about the child's education that he would provide at the appropriate time. Cora told him she looked forward to hearing them. Summer settled over the ranch in a golden abundance. The horses moved in the fields. The school was closed for the term, but she was already planning the fall curriculum, making notes at the kitchen table while Daniel slept in the cradle that Bernard had made in the months before the birth, working in the shop in the evenings after his ranch work was done, with the same patient attention to quality that he brought to everything. She had found the cradle in the parlor one morning in April, finished and waiting. He had not said anything about it. She had stood and looked at it for a long time, and then she had gone to find him at the stable and put her arms around him from behind while he was working, and he had put down his tools and turned around and held her with the steadiness of someone who knows what he is holding. "It is beautiful," she said. "It wanted to be," he said. She wrote to her parents with the news of Daniel's birth, and her mother's reply came 6 weeks later and was different from any letter she had sent before, softer and real in a way the others had not been, and it contained a line that Cora read several times and then showed to Bernard. "Your father says to tell the child that his grandmother and grandfather hope to meet him one day." He nodded and said, "Then they should come west." And she thought, yes, in time, in time. Eleanor's letter arrived the same week and was 7 pages long and contained everything, which was Eleanor's natural style and which Cora loved her for. Eleanor was, she revealed in her own uncertain situation in Richmond, a man she cared for who was not the man her parents had in mind, a set of circumstances that sounded, reading between the lines, familiar. Cora wrote back immediately, a long and honest letter, and at the end she wrote, "Come west if it comes to that. Come here. There is room and there is good work and there is a life that belongs to you. I know this to be true." Eleanor came west the following spring, which is another story entirely and a good one. What is important is that she came, and the territory received her, and she was not lost. The fall term of 1879 was Cora's best yet. She had 30 students and a room that was increasingly too small for them, and a petition before the school board for a proper building, which she was confident she would win, because she had organized it with the kind of careful evidential argument that was difficult to refuse. Bernard had offered to contribute the lumber from a stand of timber on the eastern edge of his property, which had resolved the primary cost objection of the board and left them without an excuse. She taught arithmetic and reading and writing and geography, and on Fridays, history, not the simplified version that treated the past as a clean and decided thing, but the real history, the complicated and contested and human thing, including the history of the territory itself, which meant telling the story of the land's various peoples and the various injustices that had been done in the name of settlement, because she believed children could hold complexity and should be asked to. And because anything less was not education, but something more comfortable and less true, some parents objected. She heard their objections, considered them, and continued teaching what she had decided was right. And when the school board raised the issue, she explained her position with such clarity that they ended up agreeing with her, which she felt was a reasonable outcome. Bernard came to the parent meetings because he knew, she thought, that the room went slightly differently when he was there, not because of anything he said, but because of who he was in this community, a man who had been here for years and had never given anyone cause to question his judgment. He sat at the back and said very little, and what he said was always in her support, and she was aware of it as a specific and chosen gift. In December, construction began on the new schoolhouse. It went up over 2 weekends, most of the men in the surrounding ranches contributing labor in the way of the territory, where building was communal because it had to be. Bernard worked through both days with the particular focused energy she had come to associate with any project he had decided was worth doing fully, and by the end of the second Sunday, there was a real building with 2 windows and a proper floor and a door that closed cleanly, and she stood in it on the Monday morning with the December light coming through the new glass and her hands on the new desks, 2 rows of real desks. Not the salvaged chairs and boards that had served before, and felt something that was not quite pride and not quite gratitude but lived between them. She started the new year, 1880, in the new schoolhouse with 32 students and a stove that kept the room genuinely warm, and a map of the world that she had ordered from a bookshop in Santa Fe, and that arrived rolled in a cardboard tube and opened to a silence of concentrated wonder from the children, all of them leaning forward to find the places they knew, the places they had heard of, the places that seemed impossible. "Where are we?" asked a girl named Prue, who was 7 and had recently become Cora's most relentless interrogator. Cora pointed. A small dot in the enormous territory that was itself a small part of the enormous country that was itself a portion of the improbable planet spinning in the dark. "There," she said. "That is very small," said Prue. "It is," Cora agreed. "But look at everything that is near it, and look at everything that is far, and now you know where you are in relation to all of it." Prue looked at the map for a long time. "I want to see all of it," she said. "Then you will have to know how to read and write and think clearly," Cora said. "So let us get started." Spring came again, and Daniel was beginning to pull himself up on things and consider walking with the serious, evaluative expression that was unmistakably his father's. He had Cora's coloring and Bernard's eyes, and the combined stubbornness of both of them, which all available evidence suggested was going to be magnificent and exhausting. He adored the horses with a single-minded intensity that Bernard found extremely gratifying, and his first word, at 13 months, was not the mama or dada that convention expected, but something that both of them agreed was an approximation of the name of Bernard's best working horse, a gray mare named Luster. "Of course it is," said Cora. "He has good priorities," said Bernard, who was radiant about this. She discovered in March that she was expecting again, and told Bernard over the breakfast table with the same directness as before, and watched the same progression of his face: surprise, recognition, joy, and loved him for being exactly himself about it every time, for not having a performance prepared. "November, I think," she said. "Are you well?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Exactly as well as I was before." He came around the table again, and she stood up to meet him, and they held each other in the morning light of the kitchen while outside the horses moved in the fields and the cottonwoods along the creek were coming into new leaf, and the whole territory was doing what it did in spring, which was to insist, against the evidence of every winter, that everything was possible. "I did not plan any of this," he said, his voice low against her hair. "Nor did I," she said. "But it is everything," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is everything." The second child arrived in November, as she had predicted, a girl this time, with Cora's dark hair and a voice that announced itself immediately and without reservation. They named her Ruth Margaret Conroy Ruth because they both liked the weight of it, Margaret for Bernard's sister, who received this news with a letter that was 2 paragraphs of complete sentences, and then 1 sentence that simply said, "I am undone." Daniel, now nearly 2, was presented with his sister with the ceremony such things deserved, and he regarded her for a long time with the focused attention of a person processing important information. Then he said, with great decision, her name, or as close as he could get to it, and patted her head with a gentleness that neither of them had taught him and both of them marveled at. "He is going to be good to her," Bernard said. "He is going to be insufferable to her," Cora said, "and also good to her because that is what siblings are." Margaret and Eli came for the Christmas of 1880. Eli now 12 and verging on the particular serious gravity of boys who are becoming young men and are not sure yet how to carry it. He spent the holiday between the ranch work with Bernard, which he was old enough now to contribute to meaningfully, and which Bernard included him in with the respect of an equal, and the long conversations with Cora that had become the other anchor of his visits. Sitting at the kitchen table with books between them while Daniel occupied himself with the various domestic objects he found compelling, and Ruth slept in her cradle with the deep abandon of someone who has no opinions about anything yet. "Do you still want to be a doctor?" she asked him, remembering a declaration from 2 years previous. "A lawyer," he said, with the finality of a decision recently reconsidered and resolved. Why the change? He thought about it. Because laws are how things get better or stay bad, he said. Someone has to make them better. She looked at him across the table and felt the particular satisfaction of watching a mind become itself. "Then that is what you should do," she said. "Do you think I can?" he asked, and underneath the question was the real question, which was not whether he was capable but whether the world would permit it. "I think you are the person who will make it possible for yourself if it is not given," she said. "And I think you should expect more from the world than to have to do everything twice, once against the obstacle and once at the actual task." "Both things are true. Hold both." He nodded, and she could see him filing this away in the place where he kept the things that mattered. The new decade settled around Caldera Falls like something established, something earned. The town had grown to perhaps 300 people, and there was talk of a proper hotel and a second store, and the extension of the rail line that would bring them closer to the larger centers of the territory. Clara Webb remained the town's most reliable source of information, and Mrs. Dollar's Ruiz remained its most important culinary institution, and Agnes Holt remained the person who knew what was happening before it happened, and who managed the social weather of the place with the skilled hand of someone who understood that community was not an accident but a practice. Cora was part of all of it now, not as a newcomer, not as a woman sent west from somewhere else, but as a person of the place. Her students had been her students for years now, and some of them were beginning to be old enough to think about what came after, and she found herself writing letters of recommendation and reference, arguing for scholarships and apprenticeships and opportunities with the same organized persuasion she brought to everything, because these children were her responsibility and her privilege, and she intended to take that seriously until there was no more serious to take. She had expanded the curriculum twice more. She had been invited to speak at a territorial education conference in Santa Fe in 1881, and had gone, leaving the children with Bernard and returning with new books and new ideas, and the contact information of 3 other teachers in the territory who were doing the same thing she was trying to do, who became correspondents and eventually friends. Bernard came with her to Santa Fe for a second conference the following year, and they stayed 2 nights in a hotel and walked the old streets together and ate in a restaurant, and she wore the blue dress she had bought at Christmas, and he wore his good coat, and at some point in the evening, walking back along a street lined with old adobe walls in the warm New Mexico night, he took her hand with the same unceremonious certainty as the first time, 4 years before, on the road back from the creek, and she thought, there are some things that are not diminished by repetition. There are some things that are simply, perpetually, what they are. I want to tell you something, she said. Tell me, he said. I have thought about my family's letter sometimes, she said. The one that sent me here, and I used to think about it with a kind of anger, not always but sometimes, because they meant it as a correction, they meant it as a reduction. I know, he said, but lately, she said, I cannot think about it that way anymore, because the thing they meant as punishment is the whole of my life. Everything I love is here. You are here. The children are here. The school is here. And I am here, which I think is the most important part, because I am more completely myself here than I have ever been anywhere. He stopped walking. She stopped with him. They thought they were diminishing you, he said. When I first heard what had brought you here, I thought, that is their loss. I meant it about the town having a teacher, but I think I already meant the rest of it too, even though we had barely met. Their loss, she said, with a smile that was not bitter and not triumphant, but something quieter and more settled than either. And every fortune I have, he said, simply and finally, and she leaned her head against his shoulder there in the street of Santa Fe with the old walls around them and the New Mexico sky above them, and let herself feel it entirely, the fullness of it, the completed wholeness of a life that had been interrupted and rerouted and had arrived, through all of it, exactly here. The years continued to do what years do. Ruth grew into a child of considerable opinion and physical courage, which surprised no one who knew either of her parents. Daniel became the patient, thoughtful older brother that Bernard had predicted and Cora had hoped for, taking his sister's various enterprises seriously, even when they were ambitious in ways that exceeded their current resources. The school became the center of the town's educational life in a way that outlasted any single year or any single argument with any school board, because Cora had built it to last, with the kind of institutional integrity that does not depend on the continuous force of the person who made it. She received a letter from her mother in the summer of 1882 that suggested, carefully and with the hedged language of a person attempting a thing they are not experienced in, that her parents might like to visit. Cora showed it to Bernard across the breakfast table. He read it, set it down, and said, "Tell them to come. You are certain. They are your family," he said. "They made mistakes. You have built something worth seeing. Let them see it." Her parents came in September, and it was not easy. Exactly, there were conversations that required patience and silences that required endurance, but it was genuine. Her father walked the ranch with Bernard and came back with a look that was not approval as such but was something like understanding, which was more than she had expected. Her mother sat in the schoolhouse on a Thursday afternoon and watched Cora teach, and when the children had gone her mother stood in the empty room and looked at the maps on the walls and the books on the shelves and the desks and the stove and the open window with the territory outside it, and she said, "You are happy." "Yes," said Cora. "I did not think this was what would make you happy," her mother said. "You did not ask," Cora said without heat. Her mother was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, "we did not." And then, with the specific difficulty of a woman who is saying something for the first time in a life that has not required her to say it, "I am glad you found it." Cora looked at her mother, really looked, at the woman rather than the opposition, at the person inside the architecture of disappointment she had spent so many years navigating. She looked and found, to her own slight surprise, something she could work with. "Come and see your grandchildren," she said, and extended her hand, and her mother took it. The evening of the day her parents left to return to Virginia, Cora sat on the ranch porch with Bernard while the children slept inside. The sky was doing its eternal improbable thing with the stars, and the mountains were black and absolute against the darker black of the night, and somewhere on the property a horse moved through the darkness with the soft percussion of hooves on dry ground. "How are you?" he asked. She considered the question the way she considered everything from all sides in full. "I am exactly well," she said. "I am entirely where I chose to be and with who I chose to be with, which is everything." He reached over in the darkness and found her hand. "Yes," he said. "And you?" she asked. "The same," he said. "Exactly the same." They sat there in the good dark, with the stars and the mountains and the sound of the territory breathing around them, the two of them at the center of the life they had built together out of the material of a Tuesday letter and a 12-day journey, and a half-block of boardwalk and a thunderstorm and a book, and a walk back from a creek in October, all of it adding up to this specific and irreplaceable evening. This hand, this sky, this man, this life that nobody had meant to give her, and that was hers completely. The night was warm and still and full of the sound of the desert, and from inside the house she could hear Ruth making a sound in her sleep that was not distress but simply presence, and Daniel's steady breathing across the room from her, and the house itself creaking gently in the night wind the way houses do when they are lived in and loved and have settled fully into the ground beneath them. "The children are going to need more books soon," she said. "I know," he said. "We should build another shelf." "I will start on it next week," he said. "And there is a boy in the third row at school," she said, "named Arthur Meade, whose father ranches north of the Delgado place, and he is the most extraordinary reader I have ever seen in a child that age, and I need to find him something that will match what he can do." "Write to Santa Fe," Bernard said, "or Denver. Find the bookseller in Denver you ordered from before." "Yes," she said, "that is what I will do." They were quiet again, and the stars moved in their slow arc overhead, and the horse somewhere in the darkness made its peaceful sound, and Cora thought about the word home, what it had meant in Richmond, what it meant now, how a place that was not chosen can become unchosen, and a place that was imposed can become claimed, how the self moves through all of that and arrives somewhere it recognizes. Here, she thought. This is the here of it. She had been sent west as her family's last embarrassment. She had arrived as herself, and she had been received as herself, and the man beside her had looked at everything she was and everything that had preceded her arrival and said, "That is their loss," and it had been, and the fortune it had turned into was so large and so specific and so entirely, permanently hers that she could not find the edges of it. She did not want to. She leaned her head on Bernard's shoulder, and he moved his arm around her, and the New Mexico night settled over the ranch like a kind blessing, and the story of how she had come to be here, the letter and the train and the red rock and the boardwalk and the thunderstorm and the library and the first winter and the spring church and the cradle in the parlor and all of it. The story was finished and also not finished. Because the best stories are the ones that continue past their endings into the ordinary light of the days that follow, which are not endings at all but the fullness of the thing itself, still going, still warm, still entirely and exactly right.